Starting one's tour of the Federal Road by going through Rossville means starting by considering the Trail of Tears. Chief John Ross was the Cherokee chief who worked hardest to resist the forced resettlement of the Cherokees to Oklahoma. The John Ross House is an essential place to stop. The attractive four-room Central Breezeway home has a number of original furnishings and some period pieces, pictures, some clothing, and a copy of the Cherokee alphabet developed by the Cherokee Sequoia. John Ross's Scottish father, Daniel Ross, built the home in around 1797, and John Ross lived there from 1808 until 1827, when he moved to New Echota to be in the middle of the new developments among the Cherokees. In the 1810s, Ross started a trading business as an intermediary between the Cherokees and the U.S. government. He worked with Timothy Meigs, the son of Return Meigs, the U.S. Commissioner to the Cherokee Nation. From this beginning, Ross started a store and a ferry landing, known as Ross's Landing, for passengers on the Federal Road. The U.S. Postal Service put a post office in his store. In 1827, Ross sold the house to Nicholas Scales, a Methodist minister. From the 1810s, Ross played a role in all major events of the Georgia Cherokees, from their awkward alliances with the United States government through their forced movement to Oklahoma. Along with the Ridge and Charles Hicks, Ross was one of 600 to 800 Cherokees who fought with the United States military against the Creeks in the Creek War in Alabama. One of many ironies is that Ross was an adjutant to Andrew Jackson, who later was his primary nemesis on the issue of removal, and that Ross and the other Cherokee forces took the Federal Road when they went off with Jackson to fight the Creeks. Returning to Georgia, Ross and other Cherokees were angered to find that U.S. soldiers had helped themselves to Cherokee cattle and hogs. John Ross was a member of the Cherokee National Committee in the 1810s and 1820s. In 1823, he reported that he had traveled to Arkansas to witness a relocated group of Cherokees and found them unhealthy and troubled. In response to a U.S. effort to write and encourage him to sign a new treaty guaranteeing Cherokee removal, he rejected some pretty lucrative bribes, or presents, and told the U.S. negotiator, "It is the fixed and unalterable determination of this nation never again to cede 1 foot more of land." Through the 1820s and 1830s, Ross made several trips to Washington, D.C. to negotiate with Presidents John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson and their representatives. Always, Ross reminded them that the Cherokees were part of the Cherokee Nation and as such deserved respect. In Georgia, Ross was a leading supporter of the new Cherokee Constitution in 1827, became principal chief in 1828, and was chief in the crisis period in the 1830s. When other Cherokees who had resisted removal for years grew weary of the controversy and decided the Cherokees should move west, Ross kept up the struggle. It was the state of Georgia, its governors and other political officials, its investors interested in collecting gold or speculating in land, and its farmers, planters, and gold miners with designs on Cherokee land who pushed hardest for Cherokee removal. In 1828, Georgia Governor John Forsyth signed an important bill saying that, beginning in 1830, all Cherokees were subject to the laws of Georgia. The bill had the effect of saying there was, in fact, no Cherokee nation, no Cherokee government, and no Cherokee territory. The Georgia legislature continued this effort, passing laws in 1830 that said Indians could not testify against American citizens and had no right to the gold in Georgia. The legislature also organized the Georgia Guard, a militia group to protect the state's interests against the Cherokees. Finally, the federal government's Indian Removal Bill of 1830 and the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 sealed the Cherokees' fate. They would have to leave the state of Georgia. Andrew Jackson's administration pressed for the Indian Removal Bill and had the considerable support of Georgia Senator Wilson Lumpkin. The bill offered money to individual Cherokees to go west. It offered compensation for buildings and fencing and other improvements on Cherokee land, but not for the land itself. It told the Cherokees they would have to set a date for leaving the region and offered land west of the Mississippi River and financial help in making the trip. John Ross fought removal, within and outside the Cherokee Nation and in the U.S. courts. He wrote a letter to Andrew Jackson in the summer of 1830 stating, "We wish to remain in the land of our fathers." It continued, "Shall we be compelled by a civilized and Christian people with whom we have lived in perfect peace for the last 40 years, and for whom we have willingly bled in war, to bid a final adieu to our homes, our farms, our streams, and our beautiful forests?" He encouraged supporters, including Northeastern missionaries, political figures, writers, and various other allies, to reject the removal bill. Most dramatically, Ross tried to use the U.S. Constitution and judicial system to help the Cherokees remain in Georgia. 2 court cases represented the last substantial legal efforts to keep control over their land, and the resolution of the second case seemed a great Cherokee success. The first case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, in 1831, involved a case in which the Georgia Guard had arrested a Cherokee man for killing another Cherokee. The lawyers for the Cherokee Nation argued that Georgia law did not apply to them. The decision of Supreme Court Justice John Marshall was sympathetic, but ultimately did not overturn Georgia law because, Marshall wrote, the court could not make decisions about individuals from a foreign nation, such as the Cherokee Nation. The second case, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, offered more promise. The Georgia Guard arrested several missionaries, including Samuel Worcester, for refusing to sign an oath of allegiance to the state of Georgia while they were in the territory the Cherokees considered their own. The court ruled against Georgia, significantly arguing its laws did not apply within the Cherokee Nation. This precedent that stated that the Cherokee Nation existed and that Cherokees were not subject to Georgia laws was the precedent Chief John Ross hoped the Cherokees could use to stay in Georgia. The governments of both Georgia and the United States refused to accept the consequences of the Supreme Court's decision. Andrew Jackson famously said, "John Marshall had made his decision, now let him enforce it." And Georgia's Governor Wilson Lumpkin condemned the decision. When the two governments continued to press the Cherokees for a decision, some Cherokee leaders, most importantly Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and editor Elias Boudinot, agreed that the nation should make the best deal they could. A series of negotiations led to the 1835 Treaty of New Echota, an agreement John Ross rejected and never signed. That treaty was the official document in which Cherokees agreed to give up their claims to land in Georgia in exchange for a financial settlement and land in Oklahoma. The treaty also stipulated that the U.S. government promised peaceful relations with the Cherokees and gave the Cherokees 2 years to leave Georgia. John Ross led the way toward one last petition to the U.S. government, an actual petition with over 15,000 names. Between the signing of the treaty in 1837, only about 2,000 Cherokees left the state, leaving about 16,000. The United States military put up a series of forts, 4 of them along the Federal Road, to round up the Cherokees in preparation for the trip. In May 1838, U.S. General Winfield Scott went to Georgia to oversee the process. The process was sometimes brutal, sometimes disorganized, and the Cherokees suffered in the forts and on the trip. Missionary Daniel Buttrick, long a friend of the Cherokees and an opponent of their forced removal, said the forts represented a most expensive and painful way of putting these poor people to death. It was Buttrick or another missionary who wrote about seeing some Cherokees heading toward Ross's Landing. "We were disturbed by the arrival of a company of soldiers with 200 poor prisoners, Indians, soaked through by rain, whom they drove through the Chickamauga River before them like cattle. It was pitiful to see the poor folks, many old and sick, many little children, many with heavy packs on their backs, and all literally exhausted." It is unclear how many Cherokees died along what came to be known as the Trail of Tears. At least 2,500 died in the forts and in the process of imprisonment, and at least 1,500 more died on the trip. Some scholars think those figures, mostly coming from U.S. government sources, are probably low, and they argue that perhaps 8,000, including Cherokees from other parts of the South, died as part of the trip to Oklahoma. John Ross himself helped organize some of the details of the movement and left with a large group in August 1838, where he remained as chief of the Cherokees in Oklahoma for years. Please stop the CD here and wait for the next track, which will pick up as the traveler leaves Ringgold.